In the midst of a tension-filled courtroom, a determined police officer launches an attack on Jackie Chan, only to have his face turn pale in astonishment when an explosive revelation about his true identity shakes everyone present. The gun was heavier than Karen Mitchell expected. She'd trained with firearms for 15 years as a police officer, but holding this particular weapon, feeling its cold metal against her palm, was different. Her hand trembled as she pointed it at the man who had taken everything from her. "You don't have to do this," said Jackie Chan, standing on the other side of the dimly lit dojo, his voice eerily calm despite the weapon aimed at his chest. The evening light filtered through the paper windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. "We can resolve this like reasonable people." "Reasonable?" Karen's voice cracked. "Was it reasonable when you humiliated me in court? When you turned those kids against me?" The gun shook violently in her grip. "When my career was destroyed, because of your self-righteous crusade." Jackie's composure slipped for just a moment. A flicker of something Karen couldn't quite name crossed his face. Disappointment? Compassion? Whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it had surfaced, replaced by the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of hiding his emotions. "Your career crisis was unfortunate," Jackie said, taking a cautious step forward. "But what you're suggesting—" "Don't patronize me," Karen shouted, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You don't get to judge me." Outside the dojo, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone must have called the police, her former colleagues. "Officer Mitchell," a new voice said from the doorway. "Please don't do this." She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Sarah, the teenage girl whose father Karen had wrongfully arrested and who had become Jackie's most promising student. The girl who had every reason to hate Karen but somehow didn't. "You shouldn't be here," Karen said, her eyes never leaving Jackie. "Neither should you," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear Karen could sense behind it. "This isn't who you are." Karen's vision blurred with tears. "You don't know who I am anymore. I know you're someone who once believed in justice, not revenge," Sarah said, slowly moving into her line of sight. "I know you're someone who could have been teaching others instead of terrorizing them." She paused, her eyes pleading. "And I know you need to answer for what you've done, but not like this." The sirens were just outside the building now. In seconds, her former fellow officers would burst through the door. Karen looked at Jackie, the man who had exposed her abuses of power, who had offered her a chance at redemption that she had thrown away, and felt the weight of the gun in her hand. The weight of her decision. Then she looked at Sarah and saw her own younger self in the girl's eyes. 6 months earlier, Karen Mitchell had been a different woman. At 42, she was at the peak of her career as a police officer in Dallas County, respected by her colleagues and feared by those she considered criminals. Her apartment was sparse but orderly, decorated with commendations and evidence of a life dedicated entirely to enforcing the law as she interpreted it. Her dominant trait had always been her absolute certainty, her unwavering belief in her own judgment. When Karen Mitchell looked at a person and saw guilt, no amount of evidence or protest could convince her otherwise. This certainty had made her effective at making arrests, but had also blinded her to the difference between justice and control. It was this certainty that led her to pull over a dusty pickup truck one spring morning. The driver seemed too calm, too controlled for Karen's liking. Something about the way he handled the vehicle triggered her suspicion, a suspicion she had learned to trust implicitly over 15 years on the force. "License and registration," she had demanded, hand already resting on her weapon as she approached the vehicle. The driver, an older Asian man wearing a worn cowboy hat, had complied without hesitation, his movements deliberate and calm. Too calm. "Step out of the vehicle," Karen ordered, her voice hardening. When the man asked why, she took it as resistance. Within minutes, she had him in handcuffs, charging him with suspicious behavior and resisting arrest. It wasn't until the arraignment hearing that Karen realized her mistake. The hushed courtroom, the judge's unusual hesitation, the whispers around her, all signs that something was wrong. Then she finally looked, really looked, at the man she had arrested. Jackie Chan, not just a martial arts movie star, but a respected, philanthropist, educator, and advocate for respectful law enforcement practices. He had been on his way to his ranch, the Lone Wolf Ranch, where he trained troubled youth and police officers in de-escalation techniques and conflict resolution. Karen's humiliation was complete when Judge Martinez dismissed all charges and, instead of filing a complaint against her, Jackie made an unusual request. That officer, Mitchell, spend 1 week at his ranch, learning what true strength and protection meant. Forced by her superiors to accept or face suspension, Karen had arrived at the ranch the next day, defiant and angry. Her first challenge came in the form of Marcus, a 17-year-old she had arrested months earlier for loitering. Now one of Jackie's students, Marcus demonstrated techniques that used an opponent's force against them, techniques Karen couldn't counter with her aggressive approach. "You're trying to dominate," Jackie observed as she struggled. "Try feeling the movement and redirecting it." But the lesson that truly shook her came during an exercise with Sarah, a 15-year-old whose father Karen had arrested in a similarly questionable traffic stop. Jackie had instructed Karen to remain still, while Sarah performed strikes that came close to her face without making contact, an exercise in controlling fear. Instead, when one strike came too close, Karen instinctively grabbed Sarah's arm and pinned her to the ground, exactly as she had done to the girl's father. "Just like you did to my dad," Sarah had whispered, tears in her eyes. The dojo had fallen silent. Karen released the girl immediately, the weight of her actions suddenly unbearable. "How many times out there have you reacted this way because you were afraid?" Jackie had asked quietly. The question haunted Karen. She began to see how fear of losing control, fear of being wrong, fear of the people she was supposed to protect, had driven her to abuse her authority. How she, like many officers, covered that fear with aggression and certainty. Over the week, Karen learned techniques that emphasized control without dominance, protection without aggression. Jackie showed her how to redirect conflict rather than escalate it, how to use minimal force for maximum effect, and most importantly, how to recognize and manage her own fear. By the time she left the ranch, Karen felt transformed. She returned to duty with a new perspective, determined to change her approach to policing. For a while, it worked. She began using de-escalation techniques instead of immediate force. She recognized situations where patience was more effective than control. Her superiors noticed the change, and there was talk of having her train other officers in these techniques. Then came Kevin's case. Kevin was Marcus's younger brother, a 15-year-old with a history of minor offenses. Karen responded to a disturbance call at Kevin's school and found him in an argument with another student that was rapidly escalating toward violence. Rather than immediately asserting control through intimidation, Karen used what she had learned. "Kevin," she said calmly, "show me what you learned at the ranch." The tension ebbed as Kevin stepped back, lowering his fists. The situation diffused without handcuffs or threats. It was exactly the kind of policing Karen now believed in. But not everyone agreed. Her partner, Officer Jason Torres, openly criticized her soft approach. The principal complained that she hadn't taken Kevin into custody despite his history. And when her sergeant reviewed the incident, he questioned whether Karen was still capable of real police work. The criticism mounted. Other officers began to avoid partnering with her. Reports were scrutinized more heavily, and when a similar situation weeks later ended with a student being injured, a situation Karen wasn't even present for, somehow, the blame fell on her new philosophy that had confused department protocol. Within 3 months of her return from the ranch, Karen was assigned to desk duty. Within 5, she was facing an internal review for inconsistent application of departmental procedures. The final blow came when she intercepted a domestic violence call. Using Jackie's techniques, she managed to calm the situation without arrests, connecting the family with resources instead. The next day, the same man assaulted his wife severely enough to put her in the hospital. Karen's superiors were unequivocal. This was the result of her failure to make an arrest the first time. The fact that department policy had always given officers discretion in such cases was conveniently forgotten. Karen was suspended pending review. Isolated, Vilified and increasingly bitter, Karen began to fixate on Jackie Chan. In her mind, he had ruined her career with his idealistic notions of policing. He had turned her into a target for criticism and blame. If not for him, she would still be respected, still sure of her place in the world. The night before her review hearing, Karen made a decision. She cleaned her service weapon, drove to the Lone Wolf Ranch, and waited for Jackie to finish his evening class. Now standing in Jackie's dojo with the gun in her hand and Sarah pleading with her to stop, Karen felt the weight of all her choices bearing down on her. "Karen," Sarah said again, taking another step toward her, "I know what happened to you. What they did to you for trying to change." Her voice broke slightly. "But this won't solve anything. It will just prove them right about you." Jackie's calm demeanor remained unbroken. "What is she talking about? Officer Mitchell?" "She knows everything," Karen said, her voice steadier now. "About the suspension, the blame, how they destroyed me for trying to use what you taught me." "I see," Jackie said quietly. "And you believe ending my life will restore what you lost?" "Your teachings don't work in the real world," Karen spat. "You live in this fantasy where conflicts end peacefully, where people respond to kindness. But they don't. They take advantage. They hurt others, and when I tried to be like you," her voice caught, "people got hurt because of my weakness." "Strength and weakness aren't what you think they are," Jackie replied. "The strongest officers I've trained are those who can resolve situations without violence, not because they fear confrontation, but because they have nothing to prove." "Karen," Sarah interrupted, "the woman who was hurt, it wasn't your fault. It happened because the system failed her, not because you tried to help. Jason Torres responded to 3 calls at that same house before yours, and he made arrests each time. Did that stop the violence?" Karen hesitated, the gun wavering slightly. "And Kevin," Sarah continued, "he's doing better than ever. He tells everyone about the cop who saw him as more than just another troublemaker." The office door burst open, and police officers poured in, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun," one shouted. "Drop it now." Time seemed to slow. Karen looked at the gun in her hand, then at Jackie, still composed, still presenting the same centered calm that had infuriated her during their first encounter. She thought of what she had once believed policing could be, before fear and certainty had hardened her. She slowly placed the gun on the floor and raised her hands. As the officers moved in, Sarah stepped between them and Karen. "She needs help. Not punishment," she said clearly. She was trying to change a broken system. In the chaos that followed, Karen being read her rights, statements being taken, Jackie's measured explanation of events, one thing became clear. Jackie had no intention of pressing charges. This officer was trying to implement change in a system resistant to it, he told the sergeant in charge. The pressure broke her, but the flaw is in the system, not just in her. Later, sitting in an interrogation room she had used countless times herself, Karen was surprised when the door opened and Jackie entered. "Why aren't you pressing charges?" she asked immediately. "Because prison won't help you find what you're looking for," he replied simply. Karen laughed bitterly. "And what am I looking for?" "Balance," Jackie said. "The ability to be strong without being hard, to protect without controlling, to serve without fear." Karen looked away. "It doesn't work. I tried." "You tried alone," Jackie corrected her. "One officer cannot change a department's culture by herself. Change requires community, support, and time." He leaned forward. "I'm opening a training center for law enforcement. Not just a week-long program, but a complete re-education in what it means to protect and serve. I want you to help me design it." Karen stared at him in disbelief. "You want me, the person who just held you at gunpoint, to help train officers?" Who better to explain the cost of fear-based policing than someone who has seen both sides? Jackie rose to leave. "Think about it. When you're ready, the door is open." In the months that followed, Karen's case moved through the system. Her career in law enforcement was over, but with Jackie's testimony about department culture and pressure, she avoided prison time. During her mandated therapy, Karen began to understand the fear that had driven her career. Fear of being wrong, of losing control, of failing her own rigid standards. She recognized how that fear had turned her certainty toxic. 6 months after the incident at the dojo, Karen stood again at the entrance to the Lone Wolf Ranch. This time, she wasn't there with a weapon, but with a proposal, a training curriculum that addressed the real pressures officers faced, the culture that turned fear into aggression, and the practical techniques to break that cycle. Inside, she found not just Jackie, but Sarah and Kevin, both now helping to teach younger students. And beside them was Jason Torres, her former partner. "Torres?" she asked, shocked. "What are you doing here?" "Learning," he replied simply. "After what happened with you, it made some of us think. Made me think about what kind of cop I want to be." Karen felt something shift inside her, not the anger or certainty that had defined her for so long, but something quieter and ultimately stronger, hope. As she joined the circle of students and teachers, Karen finally understood what Jackie had been trying to teach her from the beginning. True strength wasn't found in dominating others or in unyielding certainty. It was found in the courage to change, to remain open, to balance justice with compassion. The weight of her badge was gone, but in its place was something far more valuable, the chance to help ensure that its burden would be carried more wisely by those who came after her.